Chapter 1. The Funeral at St. Mildred's. The village of Larkspur Lane, nestled among green hills and lazy brooks, had not seen much excitement since the unfortunate business of the vicar's runaway heifer some 3 years ago. Life here ticked along peacefully. Flower shows, bake sales, the occasional minor scandal about hedge boundaries, and of course funerals. It was a funeral, in fact, that drew nearly everyone of consequence to St. Mildred's churchyard that misty September morning. Miss Marple, wrapped warmly in a dove-gray coat and sensible hat, sat quietly in the second pew, hands folded, her expression composed and unreadable. She had known of Colonel Bartram, the deceased, as everyone had. A stiff, taciturn man who had retired to the village after years spent administering parts of the empire no one liked to talk about. He had kept largely to himself in his grand but crumbling house, Stonehill Lodge, with only a housekeeper and a gardener for company. His death had not shocked anyone. The colonel had been well into his 70s and increasingly frail. But funerals were a duty, and the whole village turned out in appropriate hats and gloves, murmuring the familiar time-softened phrases about a great loss and a fine old soldier. Miss Marple's sharp eyes flicked over the gathering. There was Major Lidicott, another retired military man, already whispering to Mr. Simpkins from the grocer's about something entirely unrelated to grief. Mrs. Weatherby, the colonel's nearest neighbor, dabbing her eyes dramatically with a lace handkerchief. Young Martin Wade, the solicitor's clerk, looking far too pleased with himself for such a solemn occasion. And of course Mr. and Mrs. Barnes, who had made it their life's work to attend every funeral in 3 counties. The service was unremarkable. The vicar intoned the prayers. The hymns were sung a little off-key, and the pallbearers bore the coffin down the aisle to be laid in the Bartram family plot. That was when it happened. As the coffin was lowered into the freshly dug grave, there came a sudden commotion among the grave diggers. A cry, a clatter of spades dropped, and then a dreadful stunned silence. The vicar hurried forward, whispering urgently to the men. Constable Dover, who had been standing discreetly at the edge of the churchyard, sprang into action, pushing through the shocked mourners. Miss Marple, knitting needles forgotten in her handbag, rose quietly to her feet and moved closer. The crowd parted for her instinctively, as if knowing she would see what needed to be seen. At the edge of the grave, the vicar looked up, pale and sweating. His voice, usually so firm, trembled. There's already someone buried here." A gasp shuddered through the assembled villagers. Mrs. Weatherby clutched Mrs. Barnes for support. Major Lidicott swore under his breath. Constable Dover, who was not a man of great imagination, stared blankly at the vicar. "What do you mean, already buried?" he demanded. The gravedigger, a wiry old man named Seth Harrow, wiped his forehead with a muddy sleeve. "It weren't supposed to be, sir," he said hoarsely. "We dug this grave fresh yesterday, just as ordered. But when we turned over them, last of the earth this morning there was a coffin already there." He pointed shakily. Miss Marple, moving with the deliberate calm of someone who understood the importance of not interfering, stepped a little closer. Sure enough, half buried in the exposed earth, she could just make out the rotted corner of an old wooden coffin. It was an appalling mistake, or something worse. The vicar, looking faint, turned to the assembled mourners. I'm afraid we must postpone the interment." The villagers stood about awkwardly, torn between horror and morbid fascination. Mrs. Barton muttered something about the work of vandals, while Miss Giles, the schoolmistress, pursed her lips grimly and declared it a disgrace to the village. Miss Marple said nothing. She merely watched, for she had noticed something curious, something no one else seemed to have seen. The fresh turf cut aside from the grave had been laid neatly, yes, but there was a second set of tracks, deep impressions leading from the path to the grave's edge, tracks made by heavy boots. Not yesterday's tracks. No, these were new, very new. Someone, she realized, had been here overnight, and someone had something very much to hide. Constable Dover barked orders, trying to clear the gathering crowd. Seth Harrow was ordered to stop digging until further instructions were given, and Reverend Mayhew escorted the late colonel's coffin back to the church, where it would rest until the matter could be sorted. Miss Marple, slipping away from the confusion, made her way slowly along the path back to the village, her mind ticking quietly over the morning's events. It was a curious thing indeed, to find a grave already occupied when a man was being buried. Graves, she thought, did not fill themselves, nor did coffins simply appear overnight without some purposeful hand at work. The question was not merely who was buried there, but why they had been hidden, and why someone had gone to such trouble to ensure the discovery would not occur until too late. She paused at the church gate, glancing back at the huddle of black-clad villagers milling uncertainly about the churchyard. There would be gossip, of course, wild stories. Half the village would insist it was smugglers, and the other half would blame foreign spies or devil worshippers. Miss Marple, who had seen a great deal of human nature at its worst, and occasionally its best, did not believe in such melodrama. She believed in ordinary wickedness, the sort that sprang from jealousy, greed, or desperation. The sort that lived, quite comfortably, in villages just like Larkspur Lane, and she intended to find out precisely whose wickedness had disturbed the peace of St. Mildred's. Chapter 2. The village reacts. By the time the church bells tolled midday, the whole of Larkspur Lane was ablaze with rumor. At the Red Hart Inn, Mr. Simpkins solemnly declared over his pint that smugglers had buried contraband in the grave. Miss Giles, the schoolmistress, argued it was an ancient grave disturbed by mistake. A relic of the plague years, most likely. Mrs. Weatherby leaned across the grocer's counter to whisper to Mrs. Barton that it was a sign, surely a sign, that Colonel Bartram's spirit was restless and unready to be laid to rest. Miss Marple, passing unobtrusively through the high street with a modest basket on her arm, heard it all without a flicker of reaction. Experience had taught her that in the early stages of any village scandal, imagination always ran ahead of truth. What concerned her more was the attitude of the officials. Constable Dover, flustered and uncertain, had sent a message to Chief Inspector Craddock at county headquarters. But until more proper assistance arrived, he seemed content to post Seth Harrow at the grave with orders to keep everyone away. As if, Miss Marple thought dryly, curiosity could be fenced off like chickens from a garden patch. At mid-afternoon, Miss Marple took tea at Mrs. Barton's cottage, where a small impromptu gathering of villagers had assembled under the guise of moral support. The atmosphere was briskly scandalized, with plates of seed cake and best china pushed into service to fuel the speculation. "It's a most shocking thing," declared Mrs. Weatherby, helping herself liberally to jam sponge. "Absolutely shocking. An outrage against Christian burial." "I heard," Mrs. Barton said in an urgent whisper, "that poor Seth nearly fainted dead away when he saw the old coffin. Says it looked like it had been dug up and dropped in just recently." "Well, I don't believe it's smugglers," sniffed Miss Giles. "More likely some tramp poor wretch trying to hide a body. Disgraceful." Major Lidicott cleared his throat importantly. "If you ask me, and I dare say no one has, it's clearly a case of murder, mark my words, murder hidden right under our noses." The assembled ladies shivered appreciatively. Miss Marple sipped her tea and said nothing. It was only when the conversation had turned to the quality of the marmalade in the harvest festival baskets that something of real interest occurred. Young Martin Wade, the solicitor's clerk, who had been idling in the corner pretending disinterest, leaned forward and said, a little too casually, "Still, it's funny, isn't it? Old Bartram, of all people." "You'd think he'd have arranged his own grave properly." Mrs. Barton blinked. "What do you mean, Martin?" Martin shrugged, but Miss Marple noted the slight quickening of his speech, the way his hand tapped restlessly on the armrest. "Oh, nothing. Well, I had to take some papers up to him not long ago. His will and so forth. He was very particular about being buried next to his first wife, you know. Insisted on it." The ladies murmured politely, but Miss Marple's mind sharpened. Colonel Bartram's first wife had died decades ago, during his time in India. The village knew little about her. She had never lived at Stonehill Lodge, but it was widely accepted that the colonel had maintained a kind of shrine to her memory, and now there was an unidentified body lying exactly where the colonel's grave was supposed to be. Miss Marple set down her cup. "Martin, my dear," she said mildly, "would you happen to know who arranged the burial site?" Martin looked slightly uncomfortable. Well, it would have been Mr. Mortimer, the solicitor, but the colonel gave very strict instructions. Everything was prearranged, prepaid even. Seth Harrow just dug where he was told. Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. There was something distinctly wrong about the whole affair. If Colonel Bartram had been meticulous about his grave, how could such a mistake have occurred? Someone, somewhere, had interfered. The question was, why? That evening, as dusk fell in the village slowly quieted. Miss Marple took a solitary walk up toward Stonehill Lodge. The house loomed above the village on a slight rise, its once proud gardens gone to seed, ivy clawing at the brickwork like desperate fingers. Lights glowed in a few downstairs windows. From the drive, she could hear the clatter of dishes being washed, the housekeeper no doubt carrying on. Miss Marple did not approach the house. Instead, she walked slowly along the boundary fence, observing. The lodge had an air of abandonment about it now, not just from the colonel's passing, but from years of slow neglect. Yet something caught her eye. Near the side gate, where a gravel path curved toward the rear of the property, the earth was disturbed, not freshly dug, but churned and patched as if someone had tried to smooth it over in a hurry. Miss Marple's sharp gaze missed nothing. A little farther on, she noticed something else. A small scrap of fabric caught on the fence wire. Dark, heavy cloth. Uniform material, perhaps. She plucked it free and turned it thoughtfully in her gloved fingers. Miss Marple stood for a moment in the gathering gloom, her mind knitting the threads together. An unknown body hidden in the wrong grave. A colonel with secrets buried deeper than the village guessed. A solicitor's clerk a little too quick to hint at anomalies. And now, traces of activity around the colonel's property, where none should be. It was, she thought with a familiar thrill, a puzzle, worthy of attention, a riddle. In fact, a riddle about a grave, and a man who perhaps had not been as solitary, nor as blameless as the village fondly believed. Miss Marple turned for home, the scrap of cloth tucked into her handbag, the corners of her mouth tightening in quiet satisfaction. The dead, she knew, did not move themselves, and sooner or later the living left a trail, if one knew how to look for it. Chapter 3. Early investigation. The next morning found Miss Marple seated neatly at her breakfast table, a pot of strong Darjeeling by her side, and a copy of the Morning Clarion unopened on the tablecloth. The newspaper, full of sensational headlines from London, had little to offer on the far more intriguing mystery unfolding in Larkspur Lane. She had, however, just finished drafting a short, precise note to Chief Inspector Craddock, requesting a private word when he arrived later that day to inspect the grave. Satisfied, she slipped the note into an envelope and rang for the village boy, Tommy Price, to deliver it. There was no sense, after all, in waiting idly when human nature, and folly, might already be on the move. By midday the village was buzzing anew. Chief Inspector Craddock had arrived in his modest black motor car, a man of medium height and square build, with a keen eye and a dry, respectful manner toward Miss Marple that spoke of old acquaintance. They met quietly in the vicarage garden, away from the eager ears of the villagers. "I thought I'd find you with your knitting and a mystery, Miss Marple," Craddock said warmly, tipping his hat. Miss Marple smiled demurely. "It is pleasant to see you again, Inspector. And indeed, it is a curious matter." They seated themselves on a weathered wooden bench beneath the apple trees, bees droning lazily in the late September sun. "I've read the initial reports," Craddock said, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. "Gravedigger reports an unexpected coffin. No recent burials in that spot. Colonel Bartram's plot arranged a year ago. Mortimer, the solicitor, handled the paperwork." He glanced at her. "You have thoughts, no doubt." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Only that graves do not spontaneously produce occupants, Chief Inspector, and that Colonel Bartram was not a man given to errors." Craddock smiled grimly. "No, that was my impression too." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice low. I believe someone buried that coffin quite recently, perhaps within the last few days. Craddock raised an eyebrow. Evidence? A scrap of cloth, Miss Marple said calmly, withdrawing the small folded piece from her reticule. Found caught on the fence near Stonehill Lodge. Heavy fabric. Possibly. From a uniform or work coat. Torn, perhaps, during the activity. Craddock took the cloth, examining it carefully. His expression sharpened. "I'll have our lab look at it, of course," he said. "But it matches the texture of the gardener's old work coats. He may have seen or heard something." Miss Marple nodded. "Or participated, willingly or otherwise." Craddock made a few notes, then tucked the cloth into an evidence envelope. "Anything else?" he asked. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Only a general observation, Inspector. Martin Wade, the solicitor's clerk, knows more than he says, and Mrs. Weatherby, for all her theatrics, seemed rather eager to suggest supernatural explanations. Often those most eager to dismiss a mystery know it to be real." Craddock smiled. "Very good. We'll begin questioning shortly." Quietly, Miss Marple rose, brushing a leaf from her skirt. "I think," she said thoughtfully, "it might also be useful to examine Colonel Bartram's will." Craddock's brow furrowed. "You think there's a motive beyond mere concealment?" "Motives," said Miss Marple gently, "are like onions, layered. One must peel carefully, or risk missing what lies beneath." That afternoon, the vicarage hall was briefly transformed into an informal inquiry room. Chief Inspector Craddock, assisted by Constable Dover, looking flustered but proud to be included, set about interviewing the villagers most connected to the burial. Seth Harrow, the gravedigger, came first, a nervous man with dirt permanently ingrained in the creases of his hands. "I swear, sir, the ground was firm when we dug it," he insisted, voice trembling. "No sign of no one there before." "But when did you dig the grave exactly?" Craddock pressed. "Day before the funeral, sir. Finished it by late afternoon. Locked. The gate behind us, as we always do." "And no signs of disturbance when you left?" "No, sir, none." Miss Marple, knitting quietly in a corner, listened without appearing to. Next came Martin Wade. The young clerk was composed but a shade too glib, his smile too ready. "Colonel Bartram was very particular, as I said before," he reiterated. "Everything arranged neatly, paid in full, no debts." Craddock leaned back. "And you were the last to see the colonel alive, apart from his housekeeper?" Martin shifted slightly. "Well, perhaps. I dropped off some papers 3 days before he passed. He was frail but lucid." "And the will?" Craddock asked. "Left everything. To a distant nephew in Devon. Fellow named Gerald Bartram. Never met him myself." Miss Marple noted the slight flicker of distaste in Martin's expression. "And no mention of a change of plans? No additions to the will?" Martin hesitated a fraction. "Too long." "No, sir," he said too firmly. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. After Martin came Mrs. Weatherby, tearful, dramatic, insisting she had seen an eerie blue light in the churchyard 2 nights before the funeral. Craddock thanked her gravely, but once she had left, he muttered under his breath, "Blue light, my foot." Miss Marple smiled faintly. It was just past tea time when Constable Dover returned, looking both excited and puzzled. "Found something, sir. Behind the shed at Stonehill Lodge." He placed a battered, mud-streaked spade on the table. "Old," he said, "but not that old, and recently used." Craddock examined it with interest. "No initials? No marks?" "None, sir. But it matches the cut marks in the grave soil, Seth says." Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt. "Then," she said softly, "we are very close." Craddock glanced at her, understanding. The coffin had not been there a month ago. It had not been there a week ago. It had been placed there secretly at night by someone with access to Stonehill Lodge, and a very real fear of what might be discovered if they did not act. Now it was simply a matter of uncovering who and why. And Miss Marple, who knew the small betrayals and greater follies of human hearts so very well, intended to find out. Chapter 4. First Suspects. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the mist burning off the village green in slow, swirling tendrils. In the light of day, the situation at St. Mildred's seemed no less baffling. The unauthorized coffin, the disturbed grave, the missing hours between the digging and the burial, all pointed to one thing: deliberate interference. Chief Inspector Craddock, armed with patience and method, began narrowing the field. "We must ask," he said to Miss Marple as they met discreetly outside the vicarage, "who had both the opportunity and the motive." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "Quite so, Inspector. Opportunity is often more widespread than one thinks. Motive, however, that is far more revealing." Craddock had drawn up a modest list: Seth Harrow, the gravedigger; Mr. Mortimer, the solicitor; Martin Wade, the eager young clerk; and the few villagers who had access to Stonehill Lodge in those final days. As for Mrs. Weatherby and her blue, well, Craddock was not inclined to credit ghost stories, though he noted it carefully all the same. In Miss Marple's experience, even the most foolish tale could hide an uncomfortable truth. The first to be called back for questioning was Seth Harrow. He arrived at the temporary inquiry room, looking more miserable than ever, his cap twisting. In his rough hands, "I tell you, sir," he repeated, voice cracking, "I dug proper, as ordered. Never saw nor heard nothing strange." "You live near the churchyard?" Craddock asked mildly. "Just down the lane, sir." "And you were at home the night before the funeral?" Seth hesitated. "Aye. Well, mostly." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in the corner. "Mostly?" Craddock prompted. Seth shuffled, visibly sweating. "Went up to the Red Hart for a pint. Back by 10:30, I swear it. Didn't hear nothing after that." Craddock nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Harrow." When Seth had gone, Miss Marple looked up. "Poor man," she said gently. "A creature of habit. Easily led, if pressured." Craddock grimaced. "Or bribed." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "but I think not. I think he truly fears he missed something, and fears even more being blamed." Craddock tapped his pen against his notebook, which means someone else acted, while he slept the sleep of the honest and the slightly tipsy. Their next visitor was Mr. Mortimer, the solicitor. He was a spare man in a neat dark suit, his manner brisk, his spectacles flashing in the morning sun. "I'm afraid I cannot be of much assistance," he said coolly. "The colonel's instructions were explicit. Burial site arranged, payments made, all quite proper." "No irregularities at all?" Craddock asked. Mortimer's mouth tightened. "None that concern me." Miss Marple, seemingly absorbed in her work-basket, noted the slight emphasis on the last word. "Forgive me," she said quietly, "but it does sometimes happen that arrangements made in good faith are altered, especially if someone had access to sensitive information." Mortimer stiffened. "The colonel's will was sealed and registered, no room for tampering." "And yet," Miss Marple murmured, "there is room apparently for someone to tamper with the resting place itself." Mortimer gave a short, humorless laugh. "A prank, perhaps, or malice, but nothing to do with the colonel's legal affairs." Miss Marple inclined her head politely, but she caught the quick flicker in the solicitor's eyes, a flash of something very much like fear. Not guilt, perhaps, but fear. When Mortimer had gone, Craddock leaned closer. "You think he's hiding?" "Something? I think he knows something," Miss Marple corrected, "and he does not wish it known that he knows." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple made a quiet visit to Mrs. Weatherby. The older woman welcomed her eagerly, ushering her into a heavily perfumed sitting room crammed with knickknacks and doilies. "You know, Miss Marple," Mrs. Weatherby said breathlessly, "I've remembered something else. It may be important." Miss Marple smiled encouragingly. "Do tell, my dear." "It was just after dusk, the night before the funeral," Mrs. Weatherby whispered. "I saw someone, a figure, moving by the hedge at Stonehill Lodge, carrying something." "Something?" Miss Marple repeated gently. Mrs. Weatherby nodded eagerly. "A sack, or a bundle, perhaps. I couldn't see clearly, but they were moving quickly, furtively." Miss Marple folded her hands. "And this figure? Large? Small?" Mrs. Weatherby hesitated. "Medium, I suppose. Not as tall as Major Lidicott, not as short as young Martin Wade, Miss Marple's mind whirred quietly. Male or female? I couldn't tell, Mrs. Weatherby admitted, crestfallen. Still, Miss Marple said kindly, you have been most observant. As she walked home under the gathering twilight, Miss Marple weighed the information carefully. Someone moving by Stonehill Lodge after dusk. Someone carrying a bundle. The spade hidden behind the shed. The disturbed earth near the side gate. The concealed grave. And overlaying it all, the lingering unanswered question. Who was buried there? The exhumation, Craddock had informed her, would proceed the next morning under police supervision. Until then, there was little more to be done, except, of course, to think. And Miss Marple, who had unraveled more human tangles with her knitting, needles than most detectives with fingerprints and microscopes, thought very carefully indeed. Because she had begun to see a pattern, faint, delicate, but unmistakable, threading through the quiet village. A pattern of lies stitched into everyday lives. And very soon, she was sure, it would unravel all it would take was a single tug at the right thread. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The following morning, the villagers of Larkspur Lane awoke to a crisp, bright day. A morning that seemed too cheerful for the solemn business about to unfold at St. Mildred's. Shortly after 9, Chief Inspector Craddock and a team of men arrived at the churchyard to supervise the careful exhumation of the mysterious coffin. Constable Dover, chest puffed with unearned importance, busied himself shooing away curious onlookers. Seth Harrow, pale but determined, assisted under close watch. Miss Marple naturally did not press to be present. She knew that dramatic unveilings rarely yielded the most important discoveries. Instead, she walked slowly around the churchyard, studying the ground with a casual eye. It was there, at the far corner of the stone wall, that she found it. A small overlooked clue, a cigarette stub, flattened into the mud. It might have been nothing. After all, the churchyard had seen many visitors during the funeral. But Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted several things at once. The cigarette was of an expensive brand, not one sold locally, and it had been crushed deliberately, not casually dropped. Moreover, near it, barely visible in the soft earth, were faint impressions, the tread of heavy boots, different from the gravedigger's usual rubber soles. Someone had waited here. Someone who did not wish to be seen. She wrapped the stub carefully in her handkerchief and tucked it away in her bag before continuing her slow circuit. By the time she returned to the vicarage, news had already begun to trickle through. Constable Dover, looking grave, met her at the gate. "They've opened it," he said in a low voice. "The coffin." "And what did they find?" asked Miss Marple gently. "A body, miss," he said, voice shaking slightly. "A man. Dead these past few weeks, they reckon. Not buried proper either, all rough and rushed. No marker, no ceremony. Identified?" Miss Marple asked. Dover shook his head. "No papers, no ring. Clothes cheap, working man's maybe. But there was something odd." He glanced around and dropped his voice. "Broken wrist, miss. Set badly. Old injury. Like he'd taken a bad fall once and never healed right." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. A man with an old injury, unknown to the village, and yet buried with haste and secrecy. She turned the matter over in her mind. Meanwhile, at the vicarage, Inspector Craddock was methodically assembling what few facts they had. "The cause of death isn't certain yet," he said. "Could be blunt force. There was a head injury. But we'll need the coroner's report." He studied Miss Marple closely. "You look as though you found something." Miss Marple smiled mildly and withdrew the handkerchief-wrapped cigarette. "A visitor to the graveyard," she said, handing it over. "Expensive taste in tobacco, perhaps not a local man, and quite deliberate about where he waited." Craddock examined it and whistled softly. "Good catch. I'll send it off for prints, though I doubt we'll be so lucky." Miss Marple sipped her tea, thinking. It all pointed to an outsider, or perhaps someone living so quietly on the village's fringes that they had never truly been known. But why bury him in the colonel's grave? Accident? No. Too precise. A message? Perhaps, or a substitution? A thought prickled at the back of Miss Marple's mind, an outrageous thought, but she tucked it away for later. First, there was the matter of the colonel's household. Miss Marple knew that in small, tight-knit villages, scandals had a way of taking root, not from the grand houses, but from the forgotten corners, the kitchen garden, the tradesman's entrance, the servants' hall. She decided to visit Stonehill Lodge again. The house looked even more forlorn in the bright light of morning, shutters drawn, grass unmowed, a black wreath still hanging askew on the heavy oak door. But someone was there. Miss Marple could see smoke rising thinly from the rear chimney. The housekeeper must still be minding the place. Sure enough, Mrs. Rawlins, the colonel's housekeeper of 20 years, answered Miss Marple's knock with a mixture of suspicion and weary resignation. "Good morning, Mrs. Rawlins," Miss Marple said sweetly. "I wonder if you might spare me a moment. I would so like to see the colonel's gardens before they fall too far into neglect." Flattered by the attention and eager to share a little of her burdens, Mrs. Rawlins agreed, leading Miss Marple through the back of the house into the overgrown kitchen gardens. "He loved his vegetables, did the colonel," Mrs. Rawlins said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Lettuce, carrots, marrow, how I grew 'em all himself." "You must miss him," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Rawlins sighed. "It's strange, isn't it? House so quiet, as if it's holding its breath." They walked slowly between the beds, Miss Marple, asking small, seemingly innocent questions, and then, quite by accident, or so it appeared, she remarked, "It's curious, you know, about the grave mix-up." Mrs. Rawlins froze for a moment, then busied herself with pulling a weed. "Terrible business," she muttered. "Shocking." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "It makes one wonder, doesn't it, what secrets the earth might hold." Mrs. Rawlins said nothing. After a pause, Miss Marple continued casually, "Of course, one forgets how many visitors great houses receive. Tradesmen, delivery boys, workmen. So easy for someone to come and go unnoticed." At last, Mrs. Rawlins spoke, and when she did, her voice was low. "There was a man," she said without looking up, "about a fortnight before the colonel passed, rough-looking, came by asking after odd jobs. The colonel sent him away, said he wasn't hiring no tramps." "A tramp?" Miss Marple prompted gently. Mrs. Rawlins shook her head. "Not exactly. Strong enough, smart mouth, said he knew the colonel from before." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "Before," she repeated. Mrs. Rawlins wiped her hands again. "Something about India. I didn't catch all of it. The colonel wasn't best pleased, I can tell you. He near slammed the door off its hinges." "And this man, did he come back?" Mrs. Rawlins hesitated. "I thought I saw someone near the stables a few nights later, but it was dark. Could have been a fox for all I know." Miss Marple thanked her warmly and made her way back down the path to the village, a man from the colonel's past, a man unwelcome but persistent, a man who now lay buried under someone else's name. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but Miss Marple knew better than to force them. Not yet. The truth would reveal itself, soon enough, if one listened carefully to the whisper of the village, to the small forgotten things that others overlooked, and Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime listening, was ready. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. By the next morning, the bright September sun had done little to dispel the undercurrent of tension in Larkspur Lane. The discovery of the unknown man in Colonel Bartram's grave had struck at something deep in the village, a sense of unease that grew sharper, with every whispered conversation and every cautious glance exchanged across garden hedges. At the vicarage, Miss Marple sat quietly with Chief Inspector Craddock, reviewing the threads of the case as they now lay before them. "We have an unknown man," Craddock said, ticking off points on his fingers, "with a broken wrist, likely dead for 3 weeks, buried secretly at St. Mildred's. No identification, no local ties as far as we can tell." He paused. "And we have Colonel Bartram, meticulous, private, receiving an unexpected visitor shortly before his death." Miss Marple nodded. And a solicitor's clerk, she added, who seems unduly nervous about the will, and a housekeeper who has noticed more than she realizes. Craddock tapped his pen against his notebook thoughtfully. You believe there's a connection between the Colonel's past life and this man's death? I believe, Miss Marple said softly, that the past rarely stays buried. Especially when there are debts still unpaid. Craddock looked at her sharply. And you believe the Colonel's death? Miss Marple shook her head gently. Oh no. I believe Colonel Bartram died quite naturally, but his death created an opportunity, and someone seized it. She rose, smoothing her skirt. And I believe it is time, she said, to start asking sharper questions. The first confrontation took place at the Red Hart Inn. Martin Wade was seated at a corner table, sipping a pint and fidgeting with a stack of solicitor's papers. His head jerked up when Miss Marple and Chief Inspector Craddock entered, but he masked his surprise poorly. Good afternoon, Mr. Wade, Miss Marple said cheerily, as if they had merely stumbled upon him by accident. Craddock was less casual. He took a seat opposite Martin, pulling out his notebook. I wonder if you might clarify something, he said in a pleasant, dangerous tone. Martin's fingers drummed nervously against his glass. Clarify? He echoed. Yes. You see, there's some confusion about the will. You told us the Colonel's instructions were clear. And yet, Craddock smiled without warmth. There are signs that something was altered very near the end. Martin flushed a dull red. I don't know. What you mean? Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Forgive me, dear boy, but you seem a little anxious for someone with nothing to hide. Martin set down his glass too hard, spilling a little beer. I didn't do anything wrong, he burst out. I only helped. Helped whom? Craddock asked sharply. Martin's mouth opened and closed like a fish. At last, he muttered, I delivered a second document, a codicil. The Colonel signed it, I witnessed it. Craddock's eyes sharpened. What was in the codicil? Martin licked his lips. It cut out Gerald Bartram, the nephew, left everything to a man named Richards. Said he was a debt unpaid. Miss Marple and Craddock exchanged a glance. And where is this codicil now? Craddock asked. Martin's voice dropped to a whisper. Burned. Miss Marple's voice was very soft. Burned, Mr. Wade? Martin nodded miserably. Mr. Mortimer said it was safer, after the Colonel died suddenly. It could cause a scandal. No proof the Colonel wasn't pressured. Better to let the original will stand. Craddock sat back, disgusted. You realize, of course, that destroying a testamentary document is a serious offense? Martin buried his head in his hands. I didn't mean to get into trouble. I just did what I was told. Miss Marple's gaze was pitying but firm. And who is Mr. Richards? Martin shook his head. I don't know. The Colonel never spoke of him. Only that he was an obligation. Something he had to put right. Craddock closed his notebook. Thank you, Mr. Wade. We'll be speaking to Mr. Mortimer next. As they left the inn, Miss Marple said softly, You see, Inspector, the past is scratching at the door. That afternoon, Craddock confronted Mortimer at his office, a tidy, fussy little place with polished brass fittings and a row of solemn legal volumes lined up like soldiers on a shelf. Mortimer was colder, sharper than Martin Wade, but no less anxious beneath his professional exterior. I acted in the best interests of my client's reputation, he insisted, when confronted with Martin's confession. There was no malice, only prudence. And the man named Richards? Craddock pressed. Mortimer's mouth thinned. An old associate of the Colonel's, from his time in India. There were rumors. Miss Marple, seated primly in the corner, said nothing but her mind raced. Rumors. A debt. A second will destroyed, and a dead man hidden in the wrong grave. The outline of the story was becoming clearer. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage that evening, the final pieces of the pattern were almost ready to fall into place. As she set her kettle on to boil, she thought back over all she had learned. Colonel Bartram had wronged someone long ago, a man named Richards. He had tried to set it right at the end, amending his will. But Richards, or someone connected to him, had come to Larkspur Lane too late, had demanded something more than money. And now, a body lay hidden where the colonels had been meant to rest. A substitution so brazen, it could only have been born of desperation. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. Tomorrow, she knew, the final truth would come to light, and when it did, it would be as sordid, as foolish, and as human as it always was beneath the surface. She only needed one more careful step, one small, quiet nudge, and the whole tapestry would unravel, just as it always did. Chapter 7. Another twist morning broke over Larkspur Lane with a crisp bite in the air, the leaves beginning to turn in earnest to shades of gold and copper. But despite the beauty of the season, a heaviness lingered across the village, a sense that something had shifted subtly but permanently since the funeral at St. Mildred's. Miss Marple spent the early part of the day quietly, trimming her late roses and polishing her teapot. To the casual eye, she might have seemed the very model of harmless old age, but her mind ticked forward with quiet certainty. The pieces were close now, closer than the villagers guessed. And then, shortly before midday, news came that stirred the whole village into fresh agitation. Seth Harrow, the gravedigger, had disappeared. At first, no one thought much of it. Seth was known to wander off for an ale or two, particularly when his nerves were rattled. But when he failed to turn up for his usual mid-morning check at the churchyard, Reverend Mayhew grew concerned and sent young Tommy Price down to Seth's cottage. Tommy returned pale and breathless. "The door was open, sir," he reported, "and the place was all a mess, like someone left in a hurry." Constable Dover, fetched in a flurry, confirmed it. Seth Harrow was gone. The villagers, already rattled, seized on the news hungrily. "Run off," declared Major Lidicott over his morning paper. "Guilt, plain as day." "Or fear," murmured Mrs. Weatherby to Mrs. Barton over the marmalade shelves at the grocer's. "Fear of who might be next." By the time Chief Inspector Craddock arrived at Seth's small, tumble-down cottage, the scene was clear enough. The bed had not been slept in. A battered suitcase was missing. And on the table, hastily scrawled on the back of a butcher's bill, was a note: "I don't want trouble, better to go. Leave the dead to lie," Craddock swore under his breath. Miss Marple, who had quietly followed the procession to the lane's end, studied the note carefully. "The handwriting is unsteady," she remarked. "And not just from haste. Fear, Inspector. Genuine fear." Craddock folded the note grimly. "Fear of what, I wonder?" Miss Marple said nothing aloud, but she had her suspicions. Seth Harrow, she believed, had seen more than he had admitted, perhaps even helped, unwillingly under pressure or threat, to hide the body now lying in the colonel's grave. And now, with the investigation tightening, he had panicked. "Men like Seth," she said softly, "are not made for the strain of secrecy. It eats at them like rust." Craddock glanced at her sharply. "You think he's running from guilt?" "I think," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "that he's running from someone he fears far more than the police." Later that afternoon, Craddock gathered a small group at the vicarage: Reverend Mayhew, Martin Wade, Mrs. Barton, and Miss Marple herself. "We need to be clear," he said crisply. "There are two matters before us. First, the murder, for that it surely is, of the unknown man buried in the colonel's grave. Second, the deliberate concealment of that body, presumably to prevent its discovery." He paced the hearthrug. "Someone in this village knows more than they've said." Martin Wade fidgeted visibly. Mrs. Barton clasped her hands tighter in her lap. The Reverend looked stricken. Only Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting needles clicking steadily. Craddock continued, "Seth Harrow may hold the key. His disappearance complicates matters, but I've sent word to stations and inns up and down the county. If he tries to leave by train or coach, we'll have him." Miss Marple finished her row and set her work neatly in her lap. "I wonder," she said mildly, "whether it is the man who buried the body we should focus on, or the man who caused the death in the first place." There was a heavy silence. Craddock nodded slowly. "Quite right, Miss Marple. Burying a body in secret is desperate work, but killing a man, that's a different weight entirely. And it is desperation, Miss Marple said gently, that often leads to clumsiness. She glanced at Martin Wade, whose complexion had gone distinctly blotchy. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Wade? Martin jumped to his feet. I don't know anything, he stammered. I only did what Mr. Mortimer told me. Burn the codicil, that's all. The others stared at him in shock. You.
See, Miss Marple said, still gently. Guilt has a way of ripening under pressure.
Craddock stepped in swiftly. You're not being accused of murder, Mr. Wade, but you are guilty of tampering with legal documents. And if you wish to see mercy, it would be wise to tell us everything you know. Martin sank back into his chair, looking utterly defeated. I swear, he mumbled. I don't know who the dead man is, but Dwight, there was something odd that last time I went to Stonehill Lodge. Craddock leaned forward. Yes? Martin wiped his hands on his trousers. I saw the colonel arguing with someone. Out by the stables, a rough-looking man, big, angry. They didn't see me. I ducked away. I didn't want to get involved. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. And this man, did you recognize him? Martin shook his head. Never seen him before. Craddock exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. The pieces were fitting now, but one crucial part remained hidden, the identity of the dead man. And the question, who, still living among them, had wanted him silenced so badly? As evening fell, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village. The shadows lengthened. Lamps flickered into life behind lace curtains. Somewhere, a dog barked. In the distance, the bell at St. Mildred's tolled the hour. She paused at the gate of the churchyard, looking across the graves now bathed in golden light. The dead did not lie easily here tonight. Not yet. But soon. Very soon. Miss Marple, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, smiled slightly to herself. There was one thread left to pull, and when she did, she had no doubt the whole fabric of lies would come tumbling down. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The following morning, Miss Marple rose earlier than usual, her mind already quietly arranging the pieces of the day ahead. The time for gentle listening was over. Now came the time for careful pressure, the sort that would reveal the last stubborn truth. She sat at her neat writing desk, penning 3 short notes. One was for Chief Inspector Craddock, asking him to come to the vicarage that afternoon for tea, and to bring Seth Harrow with him if the constables located him, as Miss Marple suspected they would. The second was for Mrs. Barton, inviting her to a small gathering to discuss the final arrangements for the churchyard's autumn cleanup, a plausible pretext for assembling witnesses without arousing suspicion. The third was for Mr. Mortimer. Miss Marple had chosen her words with great care, a simple line. Certain developments regarding Colonel Bartram's estate may require your urgent attention. She knew well enough that a solicitor's nerves could be finely tuned to the word developments, especially when guilty knowledge was involved. By 2:30, the guests had assembled in the vicarage's modest sitting room, Mrs. Barton, fluttering with excitement and confusion. Mr. Mortimer, pale and stiff, his mouth drawn tight. Martin Wade, fidgeting and pale. Reverend Mayhew, visibly uncomfortable. And Seth Harrow, red-eyed, disheveled, brought in by Constable Dover, who hovered anxiously by the door. Miss Marple, a small, neat figure in pale gray, presided over the gathering with the innocent air of a woman hosting nothing more serious than a whist drive. Chief Inspector Craddock stood silently near the fireplace, arms folded, watching. Miss Marple poured tea and passed the biscuits before seating herself with the quiet authority of someone about to conduct a very particular kind of inquiry. I thought, she said pleasantly, that it might be useful to bring us all together, to clear the air. No one spoke. Miss Marple smiled kindly, because you see there has been a mistake. Still no answer, only shifting eyes and the clink of Martin Wade's cup against its saucer. A man lies dead, she continued, buried in a grave not meant for him. And though many here may feel that it is not their concern, the dead, she said gently, have a way of disturbing the living. She turned her gaze first to Seth Harrow. You were frightened, Seth, she said softly. Frightened enough to run, but not, I think, because you killed anyone. Seth swallowed hard. I didn't, miss, he said hoarsely. I swear it. I believe you, Miss Marple said. But you helped bury the body, didn't you? Seth's face crumpled. I didn't know what else to do, he burst out. He threatened me, he did. Said if I didn't help, he'd make it look like I'd killed the colonel. I'm just a poor man, miss. I didn't want no trouble. Who threatened you, Seth? Craddock asked sharply. Seth's gaze flickered, not to Mortimer, not to Martin, but to Reverend Mayhew. A soft, horrified gasp escaped from Mrs. Barton. The vicar's face had gone utterly white. Miss Marple, calm as ever, folded her hands neatly in her lap. I thought as much, she said. It was a long minute before anyone spoke. Finally, Reverend Mayhew, his hands trembling, said, You must understand. It was never supposed to end like this. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Perhaps you would explain, Reverend. Mayhew sagged into his chair like a punctured balloon. Richards, the dead man, came to me, he said heavily. He said he knew things. Things about Colonel Bartram's past. About injustices. He said he wanted money. Reparations, he called it. Miss Marple nodded slightly. Blackmail, Craddock said flatly. Mayhew shook his head miserably. Not blackmail, not at first. He said he wanted to meet with the colonel, settle things. He came to the church. He threatened to make it public if I didn't arrange it. And you? Craddock asked. I tried to persuade the colonel to meet him, Mayhew whispered. But the colonel refused, denied everything, dismissed Richards as a lunatic. He buried his face in his hands. Richards was furious. He said if the colonel wouldn't pay, he'd expose everything. I lost my temper. I pushed him. It was raining. The ground was slick. He fell, hit his head on a gravestone. The room was deathly silent. Miss Marple's voice was almost a whisper. And he died. Mayhew nodded miserably. I didn't mean to. It was an accident. But when I realized he was dead, he looked up, hollow-eyed. I panicked. I went to Seth. He was digging the grave. I threatened him, forced him to help me move the body, bury it in the colonel's grave. I thought, no one would know. It would be over. Miss Marple's heart ached, for it was such a very human, very tragic confession. Craddock stepped forward, his voice formal. I must caution you, Reverend Mayhew, that anything you say may be used in evidence. Mayhew merely nodded, as if he had known all along this moment would come. Later, as the formalities unfolded, as Mayhew was taken away quietly, as Seth Harrow gave his statement, as the village slowly began to buzz with the news, Miss Marple sat quietly in the vicarage garden, watching the last of the autumn roses sway in the breeze. She had seen it too many times before, the terrible, slow uncoiling of human guilt, a moment's rage, a moment's fear, and lives ruined beyond repair. Chief Inspector Craddock came to stand beside her. You never thought it was Mortimer or Martin Wade, did you? He asked quietly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. They were foolish, she said. Self-serving even, but not desperate, not enough for murder. Craddock nodded. And Mayhew? Miss Marple's voice was soft. Desperation, Inspector. Desperation drives the most unlikely people to the darkest deeds. She rose, gathering her shawl about her shoulders. But remember, even the darkest deeds, she said gently, often begin with the best intentions. And with that, she walked slowly home, her figure small against the wide sunlit road, a solitary sentinel against the quiet tragedies of human nature. Chapter 9. The Reveal. The following evening, a hush hung over Larkspur Lane, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Word had spread, of course. Even before Constable Dover finished clumsily requesting discretion from those who had witnessed Reverend Mayhew's quiet arrest, every kitchen and drawing room from the Red Hart Inn to the farthest cottage was thick with whispers. Miss Marple, however, remained serenely unmoved by the churning tide of gossip. There was still a duty to perform, the duty to explain, to make sense of what had happened. For the village needed not only the facts, but the understanding, the stitching back together of torn threads. And so, at Chief Inspector Craddock's suggestion, a small select group gathered once again at the vicarage. Mrs. Barton, Mrs. Weatherby, Martin Wade, Seth Harrow, their faces drawn and expectant, and, of course, Miss Marple herself. Craddock stood by the hearth, a stack of papers in hand, but it was Miss Marple who presided. Knitting bag at her side, as always, she began gently, her voice light but firm. "It is, I think, important to understand that this tragedy did not begin here in Larkspur Lane," she said. "It began many years ago, in India, where Colonel Bartram once served." There was a soft rustle as people shifted forward to listen. "The Colonel," Miss Marple continued, "was a proud man. Proud and, if we are honest, not always just. There were rumors, whispered even here, that during his time abroad, certes, injustices occurred under his authority. One such injustice involved a man named Richards." She paused, letting the name settle among them. Richards was wronged grievously. So grievously that, even decades later, he carried the bitterness of it. And when he learned that Colonel Bartram had retired peacefully to England, he sought restitution. Mrs. Barton gasped quietly. "Richards came to Larkspur Lane," Miss Marple said, "seeking to confront the Colonel, not with violence initially, but with demands for acknowledgement, for compensation." She folded her hands. But the Colonel, true to his nature, refused. Miss Marple's gaze swept the room. "And it was then," she said softly, "that desperation took root, not only in Richards, but in Reverend Mayhew." There was a stunned silence. Mrs. Weatherby dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Mayhew," Miss Marple said, "found himself caught between loyalty to his parishioner and compassion for the wronged man. He attempted to mediate, but when tempers flared and a struggle occurred, Richards fell, struck his head, and died." She let the words fall quietly into the stillness. There was no plan for murder, only a terrible accident, followed by fear. Martin Wade shifted uneasily. "And so," Miss Marple said, "the Reverend made a dreadful choice. Rather than face scandal, a scandal that might tarnish not only himself but the whole village, he concealed the body. Seth Harrow," she continued, "had been drawn in by accident. Threatened, frightened, he had helped bury the dead man. In the only freshly dug grave available, Colonel Bartram's Mrs. Barton gave a soft, horrified moan. Miss Marple's voice, though gentle, was steady. But secrets have a way of breeding further tragedy." She turned slightly toward Martin Wade. "The second thread," she said, "was the matter of the will." Martin flushed crimson. "You see," Miss Marple went on, "Colonel Bartram, whether from conscience or practicality, had decided shortly before his death to amend his will. He intended to make reparations to Richards, to leave him Stonehill Lodge." There was an audible gasp. "But when the Colonel died, quite naturally, of heart failure, the only ones who knew of the codicil were Mr. Mortimer and Mr. Wade." Martin bowed his head. "They feared," Miss Marple said, "that honoring the codicil would raise questions about Richards, about the Colonel's past, and so they destroyed it, allowing the original will to stand and the estate to pass to Gerald Bartram, a distant nephew who would never look too closely at the matter." Chief Inspector Craddock cleared his throat. "And that, of course," he said, "is a crime in itself, suppressing a legal testament." Martin Wade buried his face in his hands. Miss Marple picked up her knitting, her needles flashing once, twice, then still. "It is a sad little story," she said. "A story of fear, fear of scandal, fear of shame, fear of facing the consequences of one's actions." Her voice softened. "And that, perhaps, is the saddest truth of all. That good men, decent men, sometimes choose wrongly when fear blinds them." There was a long, heavy silence. Seth Harrow, his cap twisting between his hands, muttered, "I didn't want no part of it, miss." "I swear it," Miss Marple nodded kindly. "You were frightened, Seth. And sometimes fear makes cowards of the best of us." Craddock folded his papers briskly. "Arrangements will be made," he said. Proper arrangements. Mrs. Barton stood, her face pale but composed. We owe you a great debt, Miss Marple, she said. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not at all, my dear. I only listened. That is all anyone ever truly needs to do. Listen carefully enough. And with that, the meeting broke up, the villagers slipping away into the gathering dusk, their faces thoughtful, their hearts a little heavier. Later that night, Miss Marple sat by her parlor fire, her knitting in her lap, her thoughts far away. Outside, the wind rustled through the hedgerows. Somewhere, an owl hooted. Life in Larkspur Lane would return to normal soon enough. The grass would grow over the disturbed graves. New gossip would replace old. Weddings, christenings, the harvest festival, the slow, steady pulse of village. Life would continue. But some things Miss Marple knew would never be quite the same. The innocence of the village, always more illusion than reality, had been pierced, and once pierced, innocence was a difficult thing to patch. Miss Marple, who understood the frailty of human goodness better than most, did not mourn this. She only accepted it. For that, too, was part of living. To forgive where one could, to mourn where one must, and to continue quietly, with dignity and kindness. She sipped her tea and reached for her knitting. Outside, the church bell tolled softly, counting out the slow eternal hours, and in the small dark fields of Larkspur Lane, peace, or something like it, slowly settled once more. Chapter 10. Aftermath. A week later, Larkspur Lane was beginning, cautiously, to breathe again. The vicarage door remained closed, its once bustling kitchen garden neglected, while arrangements were quietly made for Reverend Mayhew's replacement. There was no formal announcement, only a respectful heavy silence, the village's way of acknowledging disgrace without dwelling on it. Stonehill Lodge had been shuttered, pending legal review. It was said that Gerald Bartram, the distant nephew, would soon sell it off, with no intention of ever setting foot in the village that had given him an inheritance tainted by scandal. Life, outwardly, resumed. The harvest festival went ahead, though the laughter was a little subdued. Mrs. Barton resumed her sewing circle. Seth Harrow returned to tending the graves at St. Mildred's, moving with a care that spoke of lessons learned, and yet some things could not be mended with cakes and fairs and whispered prayers. Trust, once broken, left seams visible to the sharp-eyed. Miss Marple, who had watched human nature reveal its little tragedies time and again, knew better than to expect more. It was enough, she thought, that the dead had been given truth, and that the living had been given a chance, however difficult, to begin again. One late afternoon, Chief Inspector Craddock called at Miss Marple's cottage, his hat in hand, a thoughtful expression on his face. They took tea together under the rose trellis, the last blooms of autumn scattering petals onto the neatly swept path. I've been thinking, Craddock said slowly, setting down his cup. It's remarkable, really, how it all unraveled. Miss Marple smiled, her knitting needles moving lightly. Human nature, she said simply. It never stays tied neatly in knots. Inspector, not for long. Craddock chuckled softly. You saw it from the beginning, didn't you? That it wasn't the colonel or the solicitor or even poor Seth Harrow we should be watching most closely. Miss Marple's needles clicked quietly. I saw, she said gently, that the truest sign of guilt is not anger, nor even fear, but the desperate need to pretend that nothing is wrong. She paused, looking across her garden to where the shadows of the apple trees lengthened against the fence. Reverend Mayhew carried that burden the moment he insisted on silence rather than confession. Seth Harrow carried it clumsily. Martin Wade and Mr. Mortimer carried it foolishly. But it was always there, if one listened carefully enough. Craddock shook his head in admiration. You have a rare gift, Miss Marple. She smiled politely. No, Inspector. Only a long life spent watching village life, and a certain understanding that wickedness is often far more ordinary than we like to believe. Craddock rose, brushing crumbs from his coat. One day, he said, you must write it all down. Your observations. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Perhaps when I'm old, she said mischievously. They laughed together, and Craddock took his leave, walking back toward the village under a sky just beginning to flush pink with the setting sun. Later that evening, Miss Marple tidied away her teacups, folded her knitting, and sat for a long time by the window, watching the stars prick into existence one by one. The village was quiet now. Stonehill Lodge sat empty. The vicarage, too, would soon have a new face at its pulpit, and Mrs. Barton was already speculating, rather hopefully, about a bachelor. Vicar. The scandal, like all scandals, would soften into legend, a sad tale told over winter fires, losing its sharpness with every retelling. And that was as it should be. Miss Marple understood that life did not linger long in sorrow. Villages like Larkspur Lane knew how to patch over wounds. Imperfectly, yes, but faithfully. And yet, not everything could be so easily mended. The wrong grave still lay at St. Mildred's, though now marked properly with a simple, modest stone. Here lies William Richards. May he rest in peace. The villagers brought fresh flowers from time to time, perhaps out of guilt, or kindness, or simply the human wish to set things right in small ways. Miss Marple thought it a fitting end. The dead man's bitterness had found its final silence. The colonel's pride had found its reckoning, and the village, too, had learned, if only for a while, that the past was never truly gone. It merely waited, quiet and unseen, for the right moment to rise. As she drew the curtains and prepared for bed, Miss Marple paused a moment longer by the window. The night breeze stirring the lace lightly. There would be other mysteries, of course. Other secrets hidden in small gardens, whispered behind tea trays, folded into careful letters and half-truths. Miss Marple, who had watched over them all her life, would be ready. Always ready. Because evil was not some grand, dramatic thing she knew. It was quiet, it was ordinary, and it always, always wore a familiar face. With a small, knowing smile, Miss Marple extinguished the lamp and let the deep, eternal peace of the English countryside close around her. For now.